The title of her paper is Studying Housing Cooperatives to Deepen Our Understanding of Cooperative Politics. Absolutely delighted to have you here, Lisa. And I think you probably heard from Rory that Alex, unfortunately, is stranded in Brittany and struck down without any electricity or Wi-Fi. At least that's what he says. But he has offered to come back tomorrow. He has been sending me texts and warning me, but he does send his apologies, obviously. But that gives us an opportunity, Lisa, to maybe ask lots of great questions around what I know is going to be a fantastic presentation. So although we're not going to be quite as bound by time, I will do an old-fashioned thing and hold that up just to keep it, moving. But over to you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, let me share my screen. An apology for the strong French accent. I will try to do my best to keep it in check. Can you see my slides?
Thank you, yeah.
Thank you. So, hello everyone. I'm very happy to be here today. And so let me introduce a little bit of my work. So I've been studying housing cooperatives, initially in the US, and then I moved back to France. So I'm starting to try to do some fieldwork there, and I'm gonna present that. There are not as many housing co-ops in France as there were in the US, so I was excited to find a network and learn more about cooperative movements across Europe. And I think that there are more housing co-ops in UK as well, so this might be a topic of conversation afterward. But yeah, so I'm studying housing cooperative, and one of my big questions right now is how I can draw comparison between different types of co-ops, because I've been engaged with very interesting literatures on other types of co-ops, such as worker cooperative, consumer co-ops, etc. So this is kind of my early stage thinking about this topic. So the purpose of this presentation is to discuss what could we learn from exploring and contrasting more in our research the different type of cooperative that exists, and what are the limitations of such type of comparisons. My initial observation is that there are kind of disciplinary divides in the study of different type of cooperatives. Yesterday we had a very interesting presentation coming from like critical accounting, which I had no idea existed about co-ops, but also like various co-op in education, business and co-ops, etc. And so since my empirical research is on housing cooperative, I have two goals. One is to try to show how it could give us fresh insight into more studied form of cooperative, such as worker cooperative, consumer cooperative, and help us gain a deeper knowledge of cooperative politics. And also, theoretically speaking, I'm also interested in how we can draw from existing and extensive research on other types of co-ops. For instance, I've read a lot about workers' co-op to explain the mechanism at play in other forms of co-ops, and like what are the limitations of my ability to draw from this type of literature to highlight what I can understand from housing co-ops. So my starting point was to realize that there is extensive research, for instance, on worker cooperatives about avoiding degeneration and mission drift, question of decoupling, the challenge of scaling up while maintaining the cooperative principles, the challenges to cooperate across borders, the challenge of governance, the recreation of hierarchization processes, or the challenges to navigate the contradictions of democracy within cooperatives. All of those would be very interesting to study what I'm trying to study in housing co-ops. And so I had some questions about how to draw this kind of connections. By contrast, the research on housing cooperative has been mostly developed across urban studies and urban planning research, for instance, also policy and social work research, and sociological and anthropological studies, which comes with their own epistemology, methodology, and therefore specific perspectives on these topics. Just to present you a little bit about my fieldwork. So I started by studying housing cooperative in North America. So I was interested especially in kind of the blooming after the 1968 movements to provide more affordable housing with limited equity cooperatives, and also the way they built space for prefigurative politics. I had a lot of data about student co-ops, so I'm going to present a little bit of that today. And now that I'm back in France, because I finished my PhD, I'm trying to see connection with cooperative and collaborative houses in France. So I joined a participatory action research project on aging and collaborative housings, but I realized that there are much less housing co-ops that have this kind of structural form of co-ops back in France. So my data is both interviews. So right now I have 42 interviews, and I'm just starting to conduct interviews in France. I did a lot of participant observation, both living in co-ops for 4 years and then visiting a lot of co-op across North America. And I'm trying to work as well on archives, especially institutional archives of kind of groups of co-ops. So in terms of outline, I wanted to highlight 2 aspects of my work on housing co-ops that could be relevant for other type of cooperative in particular. So the first one is about labor and the division of labor, because I think this is clearly a theme that could favor comparison across probably all types of co-ops. And here my kind of underlying question is, how could the inductive insight that I gained from housing co-ops shed new lights on our understanding of other forms of co-ops? So I'm going to present you a little bit of my analysis from housing co-ops to see how this just question about other types of co-ops. And then another question that I think is very relevant for any type of co-ops is tension around scaling up, scaling out, and the choice or tension between management and member control. And here my perspective is a little bit different, because I know that there is quite a lot of literature on other type of co-ops on these questions. So it was more, how can I draw, how can we draw from extensive literature on other type of co-ops to shed light on phenomena observed, in my case, in housing co-ops. So let me start with my part on division of labor. Something that was really interesting in housing co-ops was the concrete division of labor that occurred. So members were assigned at least 4 hours of work each week, and they had to divide it. So there were very concrete, and you can see it from the images, formalization of work and task within housing co-ops, like trying to calculate how much time each task is gonna take and all of that. And one of the papers I'm trying to write is how such formalization reveals forms of invisible work, potential emotional labor, and the mental load of having to organize labor. So I'm going to be brief on that, because I'm not going to present this entire paper. But the idea is that it's basically through formalizing the work in co-ops, we move from the tyranny of structurelessness to the task of making visible form of tasks that were invisible in the past in a domestic household. So I'm trying to draw a connection with literature on the gender division of labor, also on the gender division of labor around care work. And in the housing co-ops that I studied, there were a lot of discourses about how conflict management was a form of mental load for some of the housing cooperatives in different houses, but also the work of trying to make everyone accountable to do their job was a form of mental load, because you had to tell your neighbors that they were actually not doing their part in the labor. So I think the way in which housing co-ops try to formalize and discuss extensively how to manage a proper division of labor in the housing co-ops would be very interesting to study and to show that it reveals forms of unequal division of labor that have been understudied. And I was thinking that this kind of insight would be interesting to see in contrast with other type of co-ops. Other insights about cooperative labor is related to the different stages of life. For instance, in housing co-ops, there were a lot of debates about how we could adjust schedule for young parents, for instance, in housing co-ops, to make sure that the division of labor was still fair within the co-ops sector, and accommodation for different life stages as well. For instance, moments of sickness, which is a very relevant thing today. And in the project I started to follow back in France, there were also a lot of debates about aging in co-ops and the consideration of different abilities in organizing labor in cooperatives. So this is a lot of different themes that kind of came up from my work on housing cooperatives. And so my concluding remarks is that probably most cooperative needs to address this question of labor and the division of labor. And I have few insights from the housing cooperative. First, that formalization of labor as a is considered as a practice to address inequalities in this very division of labor. It enables to make visible forms of labor that was invisible before in housing co-ops. It enables to show that some work, such as holding your neighbors accountable for their share of the work, could be considered as a mental load, and that they have to address this kind of gender division of labor, and they seek to address it in this kind of spirit of prefigurative politics. And also they put a lot of thought into accommodating for different life stages, such as parenting, becoming elderly, having to do care work, and also accommodating for different abilities within this type of houses. So my questions was, how does it resonate with the debates about other forms of co-ops, which I'm sure are considering this question of division of labor as well, and how can we draw a connection here? So my second example is about scaling up and management control. So this is a very important question in housing co-ops. And it's a challenge, I think, for any horizontal, self-managed and grassroots organization that want to expand their political impact within society. So there are different strategies of expansion, prefigurative politics being one, scaling up, scaling out, and forms of collective action. Yet a big tension about the housing co-ops and maybe co-ops in general is what looks like a good way to resolve problem at one scale does not always all that other scales, which is a point made by David Harvey. And so scaling up might require a form of nested hierarchical structure of decision-making rather than in direct negotiation between individuals. So basically scaling up destroy this kind of horizontal decision-making processes. So there are a few risks entailed with that, which such as losing members' sense of empowerment, their sense of ownership and responsibility, and therefore it could lead to potential apathy and degeneration. Now I've seen that a lot of work has been done on this degeneration thesis in worker cooperatives. To name a few of these works, cooperative expansion entails a contradiction with core cooperative values such as worker participation in ownership, capital and management, which has not been transferred to the subsidiary. There is also literature on the hierarchization processes that come back through formal or informal ways in alternative organization. So there are debates on representative democracy, formalization, full control by management. And so these are forms of degeneration in case of worker cooperative. Exclusion, ownership of some members, shifting of priority back to capitalist goals, recreation of managerial hierarchy. This is less studied in housing cooperatives. Some people stated that housing co-ops could refuse to scale up to avoid being caught within the capitalist logics. Other authors studied the process of scaling out, so the horizontal expansion through the creation of new groups while maintaining the small scale of individual groups to preserve their responsiveness and accountability to individual localities. But how does this scaling out occur? Does it occur alone? And so something that I observed in the case of student co-ops in the US was that they created cooperative management structures and umbrella organization to kind of manage this kind of scaling up and out processes. So here are a few archives from a cooperative management structure from a student co-op. So this is excerpt from the New Harbinger. From the Toronto Conference on Student Housing Cooperative in 1971. I think it's the first conference on a student cooperative. And so it shows this tension Here we can see the contrast between, some of us argue that the existing co-op should unite into a federation and pay for its staff chiefly for the purpose of expansion. So trying to unite to expand. And on the other hand, the controversy between management versus membership control is well known among co-ops. It entails question of balance of power. Criticism was leveled at large co-op planners for caring little about the social aspect of cooperation. So we can see that there is this tension inherent in developing kind of this management structure for developing broader co-ops movement. So student co-ops are a form of community-based grassroots organization. The political efficacy of such form of organizing depends on the process of collective empowerment that occurs through face-to-face interaction. So having collective responsibility, a sense of local solidarity, and developing democratic decision-making. So this can be in tension with the idea that cooperatives need infrastructures and intermediaries to thrive, sustain themselves, and expand. So I'm not gonna be able to present a lot of my interview data, but this is what came up from interviews. So challenge of student co-ops is that they have important turnover, which create change in group cohesion, which also has an impact on establishing house culture and ongoing policies, which create reinventing the wheel phenomena. And I see that you're nodding, so probably this speaks to you. Student co-ops also have a very specific problem that might be specific to student co-ops, but they have vacancy during summer, so they have uneven commitment of member across time, economic liability. Also for students, this is oftentimes their first organizing experience, so there is a big learning curve to manage, for instance, finance and maintenance in housing co-ops. How to manage crises also can be difficult for students, such as fire, water damage, debt, eviction, drug dealing, etc. I had cases in my interview of student co-op forgetting to pay tax, property taxes, for instance. And there is also the question that students have limited financial capacity, so they can have challenge to secure mortgage, respond to hardship, and challenge overall to expansion of the co-ops. So that was a lot of challenges that came up from these interviews. And the management structure that developed to kind of help student co-ops ecosystem at the level of a city intervene in a lot of these problems. So they try to make sure that students didn't have to reinvent the wheel, help with keeping the policies and the culture together, help facilitate the kind of learning curve, help with economic liability, to secure mortgage, to respond to hardship. So quite a lot of these challenges were actually navigated by this kind of management structures in the housing co-ops. Yet there were a lot of tension with management. Few of them, again, coming from interview excerpts, are the fact that they lacked transparency, they had poor communication with local co-ops, created bureaucratic hassles or policies, concentrated a lot of the power, could enmeshed in the internal co-op affair. So there were tension and drama, shouting match. They could curtail the voice of co-op members. There were, people mentioned scandal of abuse by executive director, embezzlement, corruption, etc. Also a disconnect between the people living in the co-ops and the staff, and conflict over member recruitment, selection, education, and dismissal. For instance, a lot of people wanted to retain former students into the co-op, student co-ops, and the management structure sometimes didn't want that. So I studied kind of 5 ecosystems of this type of co-ops, and this kind of conflicts were endemic in 4 of these 5 cases. So it came with some risks, such as feeling disempowered within co-ops, which is quite problematic, but also disengagement and apathy from the students' cooperators. I don't know, 5 minutes, so I'm not sure I'm going to read this excerpt, but this was just an example from one of the co-op interviews showing that there could be issue with management. This is a case of very complex interdependency between the management and membership control. So co-op management structures appear to be the catalyst for students' co-op success in a lot of cities in North America. But there were forms of degenerations in student housing cooperative. And these forms were slightly different from the ones studied in the traditional worker cooperatives. So feeling of disempowerment, the fact of relinquishing one's power to choose housemates, to take decisions within the house, or to choose how to paint walls or spend money, for instance. There were forms of disengagement and apathy that was mentioned often. Some co-ops were described as turning into dorms, so losing this sense of community that was important for co-ops. And the idea also that without the member volunteer labor, the housing becomes too expensive, the commitment of the member declines, the member education becomes negligible, and the understanding of member control is insignificant. So this kind of brought by the idea that scales do matter, and delegation of work can only work when there is mutual recognition. So yeah, the interdependencies were quite complex. Now the solution that I saw interviewing people from student co-op environment were that they needed education of the new members. They needed a political socialization and critical thinking across members, also an education of the staff and the board about this question. They needed to recruit staff who had experience living in housing cooperative and who were knowledgeable about co-ops and also co-ops enthusiasts. Student co-ops also wanted often to internalize back membership processes, so choose their own housemates, and especially have the hand of having a critical mass of cooperative-minded people within the co-op. They oftentimes refused the eviction of former students or wanted to avoid them. And they wanted to reintroduce members' active participation in the house management. So they moved, some co-ops moved from hired managers to elected officials, and also from paid labor back to volunteer labor, which was the initial model of co-ops. They reclaimed internal decision-making processes, and some co-ops also worked on restructuring or dissolving the board, and there are even cases of firing the executive manager of these management structures, and also cases of delegating back the power to the co-op level. So it's definitely not a static process, and there were a lot of movement in the way co-ops managed this kind of back and forth between membership control and management control. Another way that this kind of tension got resolved was through creating new independent co-op, which was kind of an exit strategy. So moving out from the student co-ops and creating new housing co-op that were not student-led. So yet another example, I probably don't have the time to read it, but showing that, oh, I do, thank you. So this is an example from a co-op showing that things evolve for the better. Now we're in a slightly better place. Our policies are more coherent. We have figured the best way to do most of this stuff is to explicitly download responsibility as far as we can to the house level so that the board and staff doesn't even have to think about them and they just happen. The only time that there would be a problem is if people are trying to do something at the house level that they don't have the budget for, which is why we are also trying to move as much of the money decision to the house level as possible. So this shows that like the articulation between the power of the management structure and the co-op themselves is kind of shifting over time. So as a quick conclusion, the two themes that I presented here, so about division of labor in housing co-ops and also tension between member and management control, are probably likely to be pervasive for all types of co-ops. Yet I think that studying this question in different settings is likely to yield different insights. For instance, I think the case of mental load is a concept very close to domestic life and therefore might not be very relevant for other type of co-ops, but maybe it could shed interesting new lights on this question. And for another example, the very high turnover of student co-ops is probably very specific to the fact that these are students living there. So kind of my concluding opening question is a call for help in seeing how we can create more bridges across these different objects of studies. And thank you for listening to me. And this is my email if you're interested in learning more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. What an absolutely fascinating, tremendous piece of work. Thank you. It is so rich. And you know what, before I hand over, it just reminds me of when I was living in Leeds as a young woman, and I was living in a housing co-op, and I was working in a worker co-op, which has now become a very famous one. And the tension between the democracy in the housing co-op, because we have the time, the social values, the sort of making of place, compared to the workplace, which, although it was a cooperative, felt increasingly degenerative in the way you describe. And that was because, of course, the pressures of being in a workplace that had to, you know, profit make. But it was out of that, Lisa, that I then found myself committing to the interest in the idea of union co-ops and how they can help sort of challenge some of that. But thank you so much. I've also, just before I pass over, just put up I don't know if you've got to read it yet, but a really nice article by Pablo Perez Rios and Mike Shaw about their experience of learning, and actually they would probably call learning political education. In the co-op, in the Edinburgh Student Housing Co-op. So that might be of interest as well, because that's how they framed it, actually. But thank you so much. So let's open up to lots of, I'm sure, great questions. And thank you so much again, Lisa. It was really brilliant. Richard, you've got your hand up.
Hang on. Yes, that was really, really great. Thank you very much. I was reminded of in 2013 probably. So I'm based in Birmingham, and I ended up providing a bit of informal mentoring to the people who set up the Birmingham Student Housing Co-op, which started as a conversation in a bar in 2011, in February 2011, and the 2 or 3 nascent co-operators enthusiastically thought that they would be able to acquire property and start having their first members in September 2011, and it actually took another 2 years. And then at the end of that first year, I can remember sitting around a dinner table in their house one evening in the Student Housing Co-op, and one of the members said something like, you know, we've got to the end of the year, we've had all the challenges of setting up a new business and running a business for the first time. And those of us who are graduating are thinking about what we're going to do with the rest of our lives, where we're going to live next, and so on. But we've also got this challenge of, how do we socially reproduce our group? How do we recruit a second generation of members? How do we create and recreate the culture that makes this place work? And I thought to myself, well, that's basically what on your slide you had as reinventing the wheel. Mm-hmm. But I thought to myself, well, actually, that is a challenge that all co-ops have. Yeah. But in a worker co-op, you can probably put it off for a decade. In a consumer co-op, you can put it off for maybe 30 or 40 years. But it's that point when you have a turnover of membership, a generational change from one group of members or one group of board members or managers to the next, which is that real point of risk that things might go very badly wrong. And the fact that student co-ops have to do that, if not every year, probably every 3 or 4 years, I think is an incredibly powerful piece of experiential learning in how to do cooperation. And I think if you look at the other co-ops which have spun out of certainly Edinburgh and Birmingham student housing co-ops that people have gone on to create after they've graduated, illustrates the multiplier effect of that really intense cooperative learning experience of being part of a co-op as a student. So while reinventing the wheel, if you're watching it happening again and again, can seem a bit futile and can be quite exhausting for the people involved and sometimes goes a bit wrong, I actually don't think that that means it's something to be avoided. I think it's to be embraced. And I think in the context of a student co-op, if it goes a little bit wrong, that doesn't necessarily need to be that much of a problem, because give it a couple of years and you'll have a new generation of people who can have another go.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Lisa, I don't know if you want to comment on that. There's a couple of other questions. Can I ask people to put their hand down when they've asked their question? Thanks, Richard. John next, then Rory, then Ian. So is that okay, Lisa? Did you want to respond, or are you happy to take another comment?
I guess, thank you very much for the comment, and I'm happy to hear other comments. And
okay, thank you very much. John.
Je souhaiterais que vous nous parlons en langue, ce n'est pas de la naissance. I'm very pleased that you've spoken to us in the language that we probably understand, and I'm delighted with your presentation. I have some resources that you might care to follow up on. I've lived, because I'm now 69, I've lived in probably just about every conceivable housing circumstance, never actually on the streets. The closest I came to that was sleeping in the office at Richard and Tev's house in Birmingham. But at one time I was a member of a housing cooperative in Ottawa, and the resource that I would like to offer to our speaker, whose name is on another device and I can't remember what her given name is.
Lisa.
Lisa?
Lisa, yeah.
Thank you. Is the Quarry Housing Cooperative where I lived was part of a network called the Cooperative Housing Association of Eastern Ontario, CHASIO, chasio.org, I think is their website. And the reason I raise that is that that housing association covers everything except, I think, student housing. So there are seniors co-ops, there are lesbian and gay co-ops, and Quarry was an imposed housing co-op on a very, very low income community. And I'm not completely convinced that the experience that I had there, about which I could talk at length if time were to permit, would cause me to be a champion of housing cooperatives. The best form of provided housing that I can think of at the moment, and I encourage you perhaps to look at this, is the co-housing approach. Lisa McCammant's book, Co-housing, is worthwhile looking at in that. And part of the reason that I am quizzical about all of this is your discovery that in 4 out of 5 of the housing co-ops that you mentioned, there is endemic conflict. That was certainly the case at Quarry. It revolves around the drudgery issue, which is a social question. And so I won't pose this as a question because that will be too false. But it's fair to say, I think, that all experiments in cooperative structures are always socially embedded, and they are therefore influenced to a far greater degree than we as fellow cooperators would like by that social context. And if the social context is of hierarchy and conflict, then inside the housing co-op it'll be hierarchy and conflict, whether we like it or not. But again, thank you for this. I would say that I'd love a copy of your challenges of student co-ops slide, the one that was you developed, because I think that actually maps so many of the social issues which we will need to think about once we have replaced capitalism with the cooperative commonwealth, which I hope will happen by Tuesday.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. Lisa, did you want to respond before I bring Rory in?
Well, I definitely agree that any co-op structure is socially embedded and therefore influenced by social context. I would say that I've also lived in housing co-op that didn't have so much endemic conflict. This was more when there were like several co-ops being kind of spearheaded by a management structure that was supposed to manage multiple housing at once, that this kind of endemic conflict were so prevalent. And sorry if it wasn't clear in the initial presentation.
No, very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Rory, Rory, Ian, and then I noticed that Roger would like to raise a question as well. But
okay.
So Rory next, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry I can't raise my hand. It's the fact that I'm host means I don't get that facility. I just got one sort of application of your theory. Talk about where this might apply elsewhere, and then one example that may be an interesting example in terms of solutions. The comparison, and I've never written this up as a paper, is co-working spaces that are structured as a co-op. So in Sheffield, we've actually got a co-working space that is formally a co-op. So the people in the co-working space are not just tenants, they're members. And they went through a process of having to define the tasks. So the way that you talked about the formalization of tasks, so we use different collaborative techniques to generate ideas, then prioritize and group the ideas, and then they form 3 subcommittees around social events, maintenance, and governance. And the social events, I have to say, were very vital for the reinventing, preventing the reinvention of the wheel. So there was a social space one day a week, every afternoon, they had cake for all members. Phil just mentioned in Germany, the Maishauer Syndicate. It's a fascinating structure that's both bottom up and top down. So there's a project I was involved in where the German partner took us to an example, and it was several families who joined together to form an association to buy a farm, a working farm, but they're part of a national body, and the national body is, they're members of the national body, but the national body is also a member of their local housing co-op, if you like. They do that to secure the property and make sure it doesn't go back onto the market, so it doesn't get sold off. And it was a very interesting, I don't know what purists would think about this in terms of, it's certainly an interesting cooperative structure, but it's done through, I guess, a form of trust and with local associations as members of a trust body. But it was expanding rapidly, and the local family quite happy, and it chimed with what you were saying about devolving stuff down to the household level. Yeah, so there was strong local household democracy rather than democracy across the whole housing network. Yeah, that was all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Rory. And again, before I move on, do you want to comment on that?
Well, no, thank you very much. I should definitely I'm looking for opportunities to study this in Europe. So thank you for these examples.
Thank you, Rory. Ian, you're next.
I was going to reiterate Richard's point about reinventing the wheel. Because, I mean, what are universities if not reinventing the wheel for most people? So, but formally, I've seen that at California Polytechnic. There's a guy developed a course on regenerative design, and the students had to live together in a ecological centre for a semester, and that was their course. So if they survived together and they operated all the technology and they grew all the food, then that was a complete exercise. So it strikes me that establishing a student co-op is a learning experience, and it ought to be formally accredited. But I'm kind of wondering whether the corporatization of universities has had an impact on the worker co-op ethos. So as universities become more like corporations, more like digital diploma mills, and less like an educational centre, is that reflected in the pervading culture of the student life? And that might surely have an impact on things. In Nottingham, we've got lots of housing co-ops, but they all tend not to be students, but they tend to be linked to a group called Radical Roots, who have got a particular ethos. So, I mean, my shorthand is they're mostly anarchists and they're mostly committed to some form of social change, be it veganism or food campaigning or whatever. And they seem to, and the way it seems to work here is, unless they've got that shared purpose, it's very difficult for them to form a cohesive unit. So it's not simply a living space, it's also that there's a shared culture and a sort of direction of travel. And the other thing that I thought of was, have you come across these discos?
No.
So that's a distributed co-op. It's a group in Spain that are part of the Commons movement and very radical high-tech thinking in using all the latest technology, but recognizing at the same time the care economy. So part of a disco is that it recognizes all the care work, traditionally women's work, and that's part of the business model. And at the same time, they're distributed so that they share resources and skills and whatever across a network. And I wonder whether that might be part of the thinking in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. That's really helpful. Lisa, again, any comment before I go to Roger?
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess I can answer together on the reinventing the wheel. I agree that this is a very formative experience, but I think it's Richard who said that it's also very exhausting for the people. So from a organizer's experience of like someone who is trying to maintain a movement, having to reinvent the wheel with all new generations is still a hassle, even though it's a very fruitful one from a intellectual perspective to help you grow. And thank you for all the references. Radical Roots, I heard about them, but they seem very exciting. And I should definitely check the disco movement. So thank you.
Yeah. Really worth checking, Lisa, and certainly the work they're doing around radical platform co-ops as well. Really interesting. Thank you. Roger, you're next, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lisa. That was a very interesting piece of research. I'd like to build on what Richard said, because I think that it is quite interesting to see how the sort of processes of recreating, reproducing identity and cooperative processes takes place. And in a way, I think, as he said, this is possibly one of the more extreme kind of cooperative contexts with such a kind of rapid change of membership. So in that sense, it's a very good a very good site for exploring those dimensions of continuity and change. And I thought it was interesting that when you talked about the solutions, you talked about education and member selection and things like that. And to me, the interesting issue is what were the elements of continuity? We know the elements of change, which were to do with new members, but there may also have been some elements of continuity of the members and so on. So that seemed like a particularly interesting dimension to compare between your 4 or 5 cases. So that was my main question. I did also have a question that you mentioned tyranny of structurelessness, the Joe Freeman article, and I was quite intrigued at whether there were differences in the way in which that was managed in your 4 or 5 cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Would you like to have a go at answering those 2 questions, Lisa?
Thank you very much. Elements of continuity, I think it would be very interesting indeed to dig into that further. I think the management structure did bring opportunities for having like educational events that kind of try to build a culture. At the house level, there were interesting archives work that I think were amazing, of like trying to keep track of who lived there in the past, the type of debate they had, and these kind of things. They also tried to bring back alumni to kind of build this continuity. So there were this kind of dynamics that were very interesting, but I didn't study it in a very rigorous way. So I don't have a very specific answer, but that would be very interesting to study. As well as the tyranny of structurelessness. I think I contrasted because I lived in collective where it wasn't co-op before, and therefore the rules were kind of shared, but there were no this kind of formalized structure. So I think this is where this kind of metaphor comes from for me, because I saw places where like a lot of the labor came onto women because no one really debated over this type of questions. But there will definitely be differences across the model that I came across. I did live more in kind of anarchist or ideological driven kind of houses where like the idea of being very intentional about our politics was very clear. So we decided that like we didn't want women to do all the emotional labor and visible work, and this kind of conversation where this kind of topic were very much part of the conversation. But I think there would be more nuances to see across cases, and I should definitely look into it further. So thank you very much for these two questions.
That's really nice. I could just carry on thinking and talking about this all night, really. It's fascinating. Thank you. Any other questions? I think we've probably got time for one more observation or question, someone who perhaps hasn't contributed yet. I was just trying to wrap my brains while somebody's thinking. Who can, I think Andrew Bibby might be able to remind me. Am I right in thinking that we've now got an archive of housing co-ops in the Cooperative Heritage Trust archive, Andrew? We got some Heritage Lottery money for that, I think. I just thought Lisa might be interested.
Sadly, the answer to that at the moment is no, Cilla.
Okay.
We got funding for the Workers' Co-op.
Sorry.
Archive, and John Goodman and I were very keen to push on and collect the material from the housing co-op movement.
That's right.
But it's not happened yet. There's a lot of, we know there's a lot of records out there. We found the records. We just need to ensure they're saved. So yeah. bit of work for the future there.
Absolutely. No, I remember now. Beg your pardon. That's right. We hadn't got the money for that. We had got the money for the Workers' Co-op. I see John's got his hand up, but has anybody who hasn't spoken? Sorry, I'm just thinking it's only right to see if anyone who hasn't spoken wants to make a contribution. Anyone? If not, very quick comment from John, and perhaps a very quick comment from Roger, and then you might like to answer, Lisa, and then we're done.
Thank you.
Yes, the comment was simply that we're actually talking about a common bond issue, and in a particular cooperative, and unless there is clarity about what the common bond is, then the thing cannot possibly function as a cooperative. There's an assertion.
Okay. You might want, let's hear what Roger's comment as well, Lisa, and then you might like to respond to the two final ones, yeah?
Yeah, mine is also picking on another point that Richard made, which is that these are sites for learning about cooperation. I'm probably a little bit more cynical than Richard. I'm a little bit older. Maybe that's got something to do with it. But they could also be sites where people suffer from the conflicts and so on, and cooperatives of of a collective form can be very intense, and there can be costs, substantial costs, as well as benefits regarding learning. I just wondered what your reflections on that were.
Thank you, Roger. Lisa.
Well, I've definitely seen conflict in co-op for sure. Yeah, I don't know how to answer. I think for me, I saw it as a solution to more kind of informal collective living spaces. I think the formalization definitely brought something new, especially in terms of like gender role, division of labor kind of dynamics. But I think in most co-ops that I've seen, housing co-ops, there were some types of conflict at one point or another. Then it felt to me as if people were keenly interested in staying there despite this type of conflict. I'm actually doing some work on like care in co-ops and like taking care of elderly, taking care of people with sickness in co-op situation. And I think, I don't know, I feel like there will always be conflict, but there are some things that are interesting in balancing this out. Child rearing in co-ops is also a very big thing that seems also interesting for like, it takes much less time if someone is doing the cooking while the other one is helping the children with homework and this kind of things. So yeah, I agree that there are conflicts.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Lisa, and a great answer. And of course, I would say, having lived in such a place myself as a collective and then a co-op, actually, I think the learning that comes from conflict, I'm not underestimating the challenge, but actually it's quite a good grounding for getting on with life. I find when you look back, you think, blimey, I did it then. I mean, you know, it's okay, I survived. So, you know, it has different connotations, doesn't it? But it leaves me to say thank you very much indeed, Lisa. I really, really enjoyed that. And thank you for filling the whole hour. It's very generous of you
thank you.
to give the time. And I'd really appreciate it if you could put your email, if you said you were going to, if you perhaps share the slides, or maybe the society will do that. But it was really brilliant. Thank you so much. And on behalf of everyone, thanks for the session.
Thank you very much.
Right, just to